Last month marked 30 years since the release of the Sega Saturn here in the US. Sega was coming off a tumultuous time in its short history. Sure, the Genesis had been a major hit, one that even took Nintendo by surprise. But behind the scenes, things were, well, not so well. Sega of America and Sega of Japan both had different ideas on how Sega should proceed in the video gaming landscape in order to maintain a level of competition with Nintendo and not squander all the progress that they had made up to that point. How would Sega enter the highly anticipated 32-bit market? This was the generation that would make the leap to 3D graphics. Arcades were leading the way with games like Virtua Fighter, Ridge Racer, and even the very seldom talked about Polygonette Commanders, Konami's first 3D game. The race was now on to bring that experience home. Sega of Japan had started development for the Saturn as far back as 1992, and it was worked on by the same team that created the System 32 arcade board. This was the same arcade board that brought us games like Burning Rival, Sega Sonic Hedgehog, and Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder. The decision to go with the System 32 concept versus the Model 1 board during development was to cut cost and would ultimately come back to bite Sega in the future. The Saturn architecture was mostly finished by late 1993, but Sega was now having to deal with something they never saw coming, something they hadn't expected or had planned for. This was the fallout between Sony and Nintendo. Sega would now have to deal with the result of that fallout, the PlayStation. Boy, even when not dealing directly with Nintendo, it seemed that they were still getting shafted in some way by them. After reading up on the PlayStation system that Sony was creating, Sega went back to the drawing board and decided to add a second video display processor in order to better compete with the new kid on the block. That was not their only concern. Now, looking back in hindsight, what I'm about to mention is funny, but back then, I can see why Sega was a bit worried. Why is that? The Atari Jaguar. Hayao Nakayama, then Sega CEO, was worried that the new Atari system would eat away at sales for the Saturn, and wanted to combat this since Sega still had their system about a year away from launch. During a meeting in 1994, with many prominent figures from both Sega of America and Sega of Japan present, a few ideas were kicked around as possible ways to confront this issue. One idea was a souped-up Genesis upgraded system that would have improved color palette and somewhat 3D capabilities due to Sega including their new Sega Virtua processor into that architecture. That idea was shot down, but a souped-up Genesis was a concept that had, well, it had possibilities. So it was that very idea that was pivoted to an add-on, now known as the 32X.
Since the beginning of time, mankind has striven to double and redouble his powers.
A mysterious machine has appeared in homes across America.
All right, baby.
Increase the power of the unit 40 times.
32X.
Welcome to the next level.
You spill your drink? I don't have a drink.
Nakayama-san would order Sega of America to put all of their resources into the 32X. It would be hastily developed in order to get a launch before the end of 1994. At the same time, back in Japan, Sega Saturn would continue development at the same time. So at this point, you have two groups within the same company making two systems with somewhat similar goals but not compatible with one another in any way, shape, or form. What could possibly go wrong? Sega of Japan was clearly leaning towards the Saturn since they were the ones designing the system, plus it was the true entry to the 32-bit market, with the 32X being labeled the poor man's Saturn. So you could either wait for the $400 Saturn system or take that $150 leap of faith and hope for the best. Poor Sega fans back then must have been really torn. When the Saturn launched in November of 1994, ahead of schedule, coincided with the release of the 32X here in the US, being released in Japan one day later, and only just under 2 weeks away from the PlayStation launch on December 3rd. To add insult to injury, Sega of Japan would release the 32X in Japan on December 3, just a few weeks after the Saturn launch. And by all accounts, the Saturn launch in Japan was a success. It sold out of its initial shipments of 200,000 units, with the pack-in arcade port of Virtua Fighter being a huge factor in this push. In total, for that holiday, the Saturn would sell just about 500,000 consoles. The 32X, meanwhile, also sold surprisingly well in the USA. According to Online Info, pre-orders for the 32X reached 1 million, but Sega could not meet those requests for the holiday season and could only ship out around 600,000 by the time January of '95 came around. The launch lineup for the 32X was pretty decent. Star Wars Arcade, which looked pretty damn good for that time, Virtua Racing Deluxe, which was also a decent looking port of the arcade and a slight improvement from the Genesis port, which I will admit looked pretty damn good too, even though it would set you back about $100. And Doom. May not be the best port of Doom, but it's Doom on the 32X. Meanwhile, here in the US, the Saturn hype train was slowly churning along in gaming magazines, with some of the thunder being stolen by the 32X, the Atari Jaguar. I'm sorry, I can't stop laughing at that statement. The 3DO was also stealing sales from Sega's 32X and might affect the Saturn launch, is what I would say if it's not for the fact that the damn thing cost like $700 on launch. So in March of 1995, Tom Kalinske announced to the media that the Sega Saturn would arrive to the US on September 2nd of 1995, which would fall on a Saturday, or as Tom Kalinske and Sega had labeled it, Saturn Day. Nice one. Problem here is that Sega of Japan had other ideas. Now, I don't know if it was because of the PlayStation or the release of the 3DO a few months back that had them worried, but Sega of Japan thought that this launch date was too far into 1995, and that would maybe allow their competitors to get a better marketing strategy in place that could disrupt the Saturn's launch. So behind the scenes, away from the media or gaming forums of any type, the decision was made to launch the Saturn much earlier than September 2nd. Tom Kalinske was very much against this idea. In fact, Tom had already been at odds with management back in Japan. So Sega of Japan forced his hand. Tom knew that he needed proper time to get a marketing plan into place, one that would allow a software lineup that would be better tailored made for the Western audience. I mean, software is what makes a console. What's the point of having all that hardware and no proper games to play on it? So when E3 1995 rolled around on May 11th, Tom, with a smile on his face and serious doubt in his mind, made the announcement that took the media and gamers by surprise.
We started our rollout of Sega Saturn yesterday. We're at retail today in 1,800 Toys R Us, software, etc., and electronic boutique stores around the US and Canada. Our retail price is between $399 and $449.
And so the Saturn would launch prematurely. Titles launched with it were Virtua Fighter, Panzer Dragoon, one of my favorites, Worldwide Soccer, Pebble Beach Golf Links. Golf can be fun, but as a launch title meant to showcase the next generation of graphics on your new console, I don't know about that. Daytona USA was a massive hit in the arcade, so to add it to the launch lineup, that was a no-brainer. And finally we got Clockwork Knight. A 16-bit title heavily masqueraded to look like a next-generation game. Once again, not a title worthy of being part of the launch lineup. Very mediocre side-scrolling 2D platformer at best. And I know the game has its fans out there, and I have no issue with that. But to me, that is not a title to showcase a system that you are touting as the next-generation 3D entry. Again, this is just my opinion. Anyway, back to the launch of the Saturn. Retailers were furious at the sudden switch Sega had just committed. Just 2 months ago, they had told everyone that the Saturn would be launched on September. Now, out of nowhere, they had changed it to May. That's 4 months ahead of time. It stands to reason that Tom and Sega of America in general were not happy at all. Now I'm going to get more into this rivalry and animosity that Sega of Japan and the US had in a future video where I'm going to be covering Sega in more detail as a company. Anyway, the mismanagement caused some retailers to outright shun the Saturn. I have no words for this, so I'm just going to let the angry video game nerd say it best.
What were they thinking?
On top of all that, Sega had to deal with this right out of the starting gate here in the US.
Join me for a brief presentation. $299.
So on top of Sega of Japan forcing the hand of the US branch, now they had to deal with the price point. According to some numbers online, around 60,000 units were sold at launch. This mostly attributed to the surprise unveiling, leaving Sega not enough time to ship out units to distributors nationwide in time. Plus, I am sure gamers out there were saving up money for the September launch, meaning most probably could not get the Saturn as early as March. Even if you were interested in the Saturn, there was a problem. Sega didn't have enough units or software to properly execute the launch. So what happened here is that the few retailers that did have the console could not make a profit from the sold software, since there were only 6 titles and not much variation overall. So now jaded fans of Sega might be willing to try the PlayStation when September rolled around. This early release decision not only hurt sales, but it hurt Sega's reputation with gamers, with distributors, and most importantly, developers. By the time the PlayStation launched on September 9, Sega had sold around 80,000 units in total here in the US. The 32X, meanwhile, was not doing so well behind the scenes. Developers were hesitant to make games for it. Developing kits for it were hard to come by, and those that did get one got it so late into the production cycle, meaning that those that did go through and make a game for the 32X would do so under crunch time, meaning quality would take a hit. Plus, the Saturn had been released way ahead of schedule, so this meant companies would much rather concentrate all of their efforts on the Saturn, because by releasing it, Sega had shown their hand. They would not be backing the 32X in the near future, which meant there was no future for it. Sega knew that they had bit off more than they could chew. They now had 2 simultaneous competing systems. That meant 2 ecosystems, 2 hardwares, publishers on 2. You get the idea. So Sega did what Nintendo don't. They pulled the plug on the 32X around 1995 on the hush hush, but technically was discontinued in 1996. Sega Vice President of Marketing Mike Ribeiro said it best in this article published on EGM issue number 78.
I won't lie to you. We screwed up with 32X. We overpromised and underdelivered.
In total, the 32X sold around 800,000 units, with the game library topping at 40. No, that wasn't a mistake or a typo. 40, that's it. So, if you're into collecting full console libraries, the Super Graphics, the Virtual Boy, and the 32X are good consoles to start with. Meanwhile, by the end of 1995, the Saturn's library had grown to showcase titles such as Bug, Shinobi Legions, Street Fighter the Movie, Virtual Highlight, Virtual Cop, and Clockwork Knight 2, because the first was such a breathtaking addition to the gaming landscape, there just had to be a part 2. In total, the Saturn library ended up having 1,028 games. 775 of those games were Japanese-only exclusives, and would go on to port over some beloved arcade titles of that time, and do so virtually identically to its arcade counterparts, thanks to the usage of the 4MB RAM card expansion module. When Saturn Day did finally come around, Sega tried to sweeten the deal for those that had waited or were hesitant on getting a Saturn by offering up to 3 games for free with their purchase.
Listen, if you buy a Sega Saturn before September 30th, you get 3 free games! That's $150 value!
Dr. Forrest, dial 118, please.
Sega
Saturn!
Then on October 2nd of 1995, Sega dropped the pricing of the Saturn to $299 and offered Virtua Fighter Remix as the new pack-in game as part of that bundle. By the end of 1995, the number of Saturns sold came to around 470,000 units, and this is a number that is not set in stone as there are many conflicting numbers from different sources, including Sega themselves. But by mid-1996, amid all of that tension behind the scenes in Sega, Tom Kalinske, the man who had steered Sega through the 16-bit era and pioneered a marketing scheme that is nothing short of brilliant, and helped Sega emerge and flourish beyond the shadow that was Nintendo, would step down as US CEO but would remain on board as a member of the board of directors at Sega. In came Bernie Stolar, former Sony executive vice president, and one of the first things that he made clear to not only Sega of Japan, but gamers in general, is that he was not a fan of the Saturn. With poor dev kits being distributed and overall poor learning tools for the Saturn, more and more developers began to shy away from that console in favor of their new arch rival. So Sega marked down the Saturn to $249.99 on March of 1996, and by May of that year, Sega had moved around 500,000 units here in the US. PlayStation marked down its system to $199 that same month, which meant that Sega had no choice but to follow suit. Problem with that is that the Saturn cost more to produce than the PlayStation, which meant Sega had less and less profitable room with each reduction. Initial cost to manufacture a Saturn was originally around $380, but Sega had managed to get those costs down to around $230. Thanks to this, their loss was more negligible, but they were still bleeding financially. But if you had waited this long to get a Saturn, you were rewarded with a great bundle promotion. 3 games with the purchase of a Saturn starting in September to coincide with the launch of the Nintendo 64 in the US.
Buy the powerful Sega Saturn gaming system between now and the end of the year, and we'll give you 3 of Sega Saturn's top-selling arcade games free. That's Virtua Cop, Daytona USA, and Virtua Fighter 2. $189 worth of games, absolutely free. So hurry, luck like this just won't last.
This right here was a great promotion, as by then, the library of the Saturn had some major titles under its belt to better compete with the N64, which launched with only 2 games, believe it or not, Pilot Wing 64 and Super Mario 64. But all of this was delaying the inevitable. The PlayStation was not only getting exclusive titles down the road heading into 1997, but many games that were similar or competing ports looked better on the PlayStation, unless you were importing games and making use of the 4 MB cart. And on top of that, developers started to cancel planned titles for the Saturn. By the end of 1996, the Saturn had sold around 1.6 million units in total here in the US. With the PlayStation and even the N64 beating the Saturn on head-to-head sales, Bernie Stolar made the shocking statement on E3 in June of 1997 that the Saturn was not in their future. This right here was the final nail in the coffin. In total, the Saturn would only go on to sell 1.8 million units in the US, with the majority of them being sold in Japan, 5.75 million to be exact. Shockingly enough, this would make the Saturn the best-selling Sega home console in that region. Now, let's see what the Saturn brought to the table as far as games went. Virtua Fighter was the packing title, and you know what, for good reason. While it was a huge deal in Japan, it was not as popular here in the States. Plus, it played a bit sluggish, an issue that would be rectified in the sequels. Other memorable titles in this genre were Cyberbots, which did not see a release here in the States, and you know what? That's a shame, because this game is awesome. Marvel Super Heroes vs. Street Fighter, a near-perfect arcade port, another Japanese exclusive. Virtua Fighter 2, an improvement in every which way from the original. Street Fighter Alpha 3, which uses the 4 MB card and once again, released only in Japan. And Fighters Mega Mix, which combines fighters from Fighting Viper and Virtua Fighter. Over on the sports genre, you know what, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name, but I think it's safe to say that it's a Japanese exclusive game. Mike Ditka Quarterback Attack, a fun football game. Said no one ever of this title. It's just short clips of you controlling a quarterback followed by FMV clips. If I want to watch football, actually watch it, I would tune in Sunday to one of the local channels. Yeah, at least we have a clip of Mike Ditka throwing a chair. Oh, wait a minute. Doesn't he usually do that? Sega Worldwide Soccer 1997. This one is an improvement from Worldwide Soccer 95 in that it uses polygons for the players. Otherwise, it plays similar to the first one. 10-Pin Alley. It's bowling without having to rent bowling shoes. Zap Snowboarding Tricks. This was a Japanese exclusive that looks fun, so it's a shame that it was not brought over here to the States. Over on the RPG genre, we have Virtua Highlight. This has got to be one of the worst RPG series in the history of the universe, yet they kept making them for some reason. You know what? I'm gonna take a look at this series down the road. God, just saying virtual highlight, it just threw up in my mouth a bit when I said it. Dragon Force, a tactical battle RPG that is a welcome sight after playing virtual highlight. Oh, God, I said it again. Magic Knight Ray Earth, the very last US Saturn release game. It's an RPG based on the manga of the same name that was very popular in Japan back in the 90s. Legend of Oasis, I actually own this one, and it is a very fun adventure game with an RPG feel to it, but mostly veers towards action. And finally, we got Princess Crown, as this is another one that never got ported outside of Japan, but recently was translated to English. I'm gonna have to check this one out, it looks impressive. Over on the action genre, we got Saturn Bomberman, which brought more mayhem to the series by allowing 10 players multiplayer fun at the same time. Virtual On, if you like mechs and fast action, 3D gameplay, and you know what, you can't go wrong here. Willy Wombat was exclusive to Japan and interesting, and I will leave it at that. Burning Rangers is considered to be one of the best visual games that push the Saturn's capabilities like no other game. I've actually yet to play this one, but it looks good. Nights into Dreams was the big title that was supposed to fill that gap left by the missing Sonic game. Another impressive looking title for that system. Over on the racing genre, Outrun, that was an arcade masterpiece, so it was nice to see a fully identical port on the Saturn that played smooth and had great audio to boot. High Velocity Mountain Racing Challenge. This racer is fast paced and a nice change from Daytona USA. Sega Rally is a game I can't ignore on the platform since it is considered by many to be the best racing experience on the Saturn. Scorcher feels like F-Zero in a post-apocalyptic world inside a nightmare. You know what, it's a interesting and unique look for a racer. GT24 may look like any other racer out there, but it does have a 24-hour mode that plays out like an endurance challenge. It's interesting. On the shooter genre, we have Radiant Silvergun. That's a title that I can't pass up when talking about the Saturn. It is a fun and well-made shooter that mixes 2D gameplay with 3D polygon enemies and a unique gameplay mechanic. Dodonpachi is just all-out action with lots of enemies and tons of color. This one is fun. Hyperduel is a frantic shooter where you don't really pilot a spaceship but a mech suit. Very cool enemies and bosses in this title. Salamander Deluxe Pack was released on PlayStation as well, but both ports were Japan exclusive. What a shame. This one includes Salamander 2, which has never had a standalone release on any console. Gekirindan was a Japan exclusive title that is not widely known, but it's a nice addition to the shooters in the system. So while Japan had access to a plethora of games, the Western market had to make do with only 253 of the total, meaning we missed out on many great games across many different genres on the Saturn. And as a gamer, that's just unacceptable. So you're probably thinking, wow, what a bummer of a video. It was mostly spent bad-mouthing Sega and the Saturn. Unfortunately, this is history. This is what happened. So I could try and spin it in a more enthusiastic manner, but the end results don't change. I don't hate Saturn, but the truth is that it was a commercial failure. But was it a failure as a console? Most people will link one failure with the other, but I'm going to disagree with that. The Saturn was an impressive piece of hardware that was just not backed up properly by the very company that created it. Developers through the years have stated that Sega just didn't provide proper dev kits that allowed them to create games that took full advantage of the 8 processors in the motherboard, so lots of games looked inferior when compared to the PlayStation. I still don't understand how the Saturn could not do transparency. What the hell? I mean, Super Nintendo was doing this one generation earlier. Sega, come on. The mishaps in marketing outside of Japan also left developers wary on Sega's handling of the Saturn, and clearly, they flocked over to the console that was penetrating consumer homes to maximize their sales. And from a business standpoint, I understand. As it stands today, the Saturn might be one of the best consoles ever to flop so hard.
Hey!
Okay, one of the worst best flops ever. The fact that emulation for the Saturn is near perfect and translation of Japanese exclusive games are being made by the fan community makes its library a treasure trove waiting to be discovered and enjoyed. Also, one cannot talk about the Saturn and not include the 32X in the conversation, as they are different sides of the same coin. They are intertwined and their fates depended and were affected by the other in some way. I actually owned a Saturn for years after it was gifted to me by my nephew, who grew tired of it a few years after he had received it. I enjoyed games like Legend of Oasis and Panzer Dragoon Spy, which is one of the best rail shooters of that era. But the must-play titles for me were always outside of the Saturn, and I would go on to sell it many years later, around 2011 maybe, for around $45. Nope, you heard me right. I sold it for $45 with a couple games. So, what memories do you have of the Saturn or the 32X or both? Do you agree of how Sega handled things during that time? Share with us all and see you in my next video. In the meantime, keep watching and keep gaming.
野球しようぜ。
オッケー。
行こう行こう。お前ら今日はやったよ。
任しとけ。
瀬形三四郎。取れよ。ほら。
瀬形三四郎。
瀬形三四郎。